Hello! Today we're going to talk about the idea of generalship during the First World War and welcoming back Dr Simon Peaple. So, welcome back to the programme.
Thank you for having me back.
So, back in 2014, then Education Secretary Michael Gove published an essay on the way the First World War has been treated in history, and at one point he says, the conflict for many years has been seen through the fictional prism of dramas such as Oh What a Lovely War, The Monocled Mutineer and Blackadder as a misbegotten shambles, a series of catastrophic mistakes perpetuated by an out-of-touch elite. Even to this day, there are left-wing academics all too happy to feed those myths. As a historian of the First World War, what would be your thoughts on Michael Gove's statement?
I think the difficulty that everybody has with the First World War is that it's more subtle than any one person's picture may make it look. So if you take, as the most recent, if you take Blackadder for example, it constantly argues that the troops haven't got any food. The sort of surprise dishes where the rat surprise and all that, and that's very inaccurate. The British Army was probably the best fed army in the First World War, which is one of the reasons why it managed to get through all the problems it had. That's not to say that men didn't go without their dinner on certain days, or that we might look back on it and say, gosh, how boring it would have been to have had that most days. But nonetheless, by the standards of its day, it was very well fed. The French were much less well fed. Hence, part of the focus of the 1917 mutinies was actually on getting rations. So there are lots of things where you could sort of pick a hole here or there. But the debate really is about where Britain sees the generals, the command of the General Melcher is portrayed as a complete bumbling idiot, and Darling goes around sort of going, yes sir, whatever sir, so it was machine guns for the fullbacks at Harrow, is sort of the classic sort of line where he's completely misunderstanding the conjunction, and they're taking the mickey out of the thought that being good at games would make you a good officer, would therefore make you a good soldier, and all the rest of it. So if you take Gove's statement, it's not about perpetuating myths. It's about the fact that there are divergent views on what the conduct of the British Army was about during the First World War and who was to blame. And the first sort of initial phase came with the immediate aftermath of the war, and people like Haig and others, and Sir John French, who'd been dropped as leader of the BEF in 1915. Sir John French becomes the Viscount Ypres, which reflected on the fact that he was famous for his defence of Ypres in the first battle with his men at the time. So that was fine. Haig got his title and also a chunk of cash, which sort of was ironic in the sense that you get more the higher up you are, which meant that some soldiers in their memoirs said, well, I did feel a bit jealous because I had been stuck there in the front line being shot at. He got way more than I did, and I only got what I got. So yes, there was a bit of grumbling, but basically society did what society traditionally did, which was honour people according to their rank rather than necessarily what they'd actually done. So everything starts off by trying to shoehorn the image of the First World War into the society which gave birth to it. And if you look at the funeral of Viscount French, numerous old soldiers were there. They remembered him apparently quite fondly, and you could understand that they thought he was a soldier, because he'd been in various campaigns before, and during the retreat, when some of them lost their baggage, nonetheless he had given the order that they should ride on their limbers rather than have loads of baggage. So you could sense in a way that those men felt some link to him. Haig, of course, busied himself with what became the Poppy Appeal, the Royal British Legion. So again, there was a certain amount of link-up afterwards. That stayed as a kind of view of the First World War, that we were all jolly good chaps together, till 1929, when The War the Infantry Knew was published. That began to lift the lid a bit on what it was really like to serve in the trenches in the First World War. It was an account which gave a day-to-day feel, that made it clear that not everybody was happy all of the time, that sometimes they felt bitter and down, and other times they could see what was going on, often feeling quite lost. And certainly that battalion at the Somme was one of those where things hadn't gone well. They were then pulled in to follow up, and there are comments made about what it would be like to go into action now that X unit has messed things up. So it was more brutal and more of a genuine account of what it felt like to be a frontline unit in the First World War. Then, of course, Second World War comes, so there's a kind of rallying around, and everybody sort of begins to sort of look back again with a bit of positive aura, because the generation of men going off to fight World War II are largely the sons of those people who fought in or the next generation anyway, and therefore, looking back on their service, you can respect. If Dad got called up in 1916 and you're called up in 1941, say, then your recognition of what they did, your understanding of what they did, the fact that the army isn't a democracy, just gets reinforced. But in a positive way. You've shared that. You haven't shared the trench experience, but you shared the feelings of combat, the nervousness. I mean, the men waiting in their landing craft or ships in the run-up to D-Day must have felt pretty similar to a lot of the men who were waiting for the 1st of July in 1916. So it sort of takes a steady go through. And then you get the anniversaries, and then you begin to get some distance. So, and all through the 20s and 30s, the official history has been published. And the official history, led by Edmonds, is a work which is designed not to upset things. So senior generals are consulted on the texts. Those who'd fallen out with the military establishment or the establishment during the war find themselves getting less well treated than those who didn't. And the official history certainly protects some people from being examined for some very big mistakes. But that then, as I say, gets taken into World War II. World War II has its own sort of dramas, and to a certain extent, World War II sees a renewal of the promises made in 1919, and in this case, fulfilment. So after the Second World War, the homes fit for heroes. I mean, clearly there wouldn't be what most people would today think was a modern home. But at the time, thousands of houses were built, and famously, the Conservatives as well as Labour, so after Labour win in 1945, they built council houses, and then houses are built by Macmillan, Conservative politician, and people queried with him why he was building council houses, and he alluded to the men who'd served with him in the trenches, and said, I'm building houses for them or their children, probably, given the passage of time. But nonetheless, there was that feeling that those men who he'd served with at the Somme, their children deserved a proper house to live in. So he had no problem building council houses either. So you get a sort of tonal change afterwards where people are beginning to fulfil those objectives that should have been fulfilled in 1919. Then you get into the 1960s and you start to get the challenge because you've got the famous Great War series. Some of us watched assiduously every week in the days when you could only watch the programme when it was shown, negotiating Sunday dinner with mum and so on. But that changes with Clark, because Clark comes out with his book Lions Led by Donkeys, and he borrows the Ludendorff quote, and he says, this is what was the case, these lions, that Ludendorff referred to lions led by donkeys. Now, the first thing, of course, you'd have to say is, should you believe what Ludendorff says? After all, Ludendorff had his own axe to grind. He had to explain why Germany had finally lost the war. And if you say to a junior British officer that the British Army was made up of lions led by donkeys, then one of the lions is likely to accept the compliment without challenging the other half of it, which is led by donkeys. So Lions Led by Donkeys with Clark's book really gets at that concept, the Somme. People died in droves. Why did it go so wrong? Now that ignores the bits that went right. And it's quite understandable that some people today will say, yes, but you're missing out this or you're missing out that. But awful lot did go wrong. And you have to ask the question, why did it go wrong? Someone like General Hunter Weston, he's not performed well at Loos in 1915, but he's an absolute supporter of Haig. And when Haig becomes Commander-in-Chief of the BEF, Hunter Weston's guaranteed a position. So these people are not accountable for their performance. And in modern terms, we'd say, well, they're not accountable. Therefore, this shows that this is why things went wrong. Why was it that it took so long to get some of these ideas accepted? That view that things had actually gone badly, that the First World War was a travesty where upper-class generals who were upper class, to a degree French wasn't, but he was still from the minor gentry. He couldn't afford the lifestyle of a British officer in the cavalry, which is why he ended up in debt to Haig. But nonetheless, he wasn't coming from the poor. He wasn't a kind of sharp character promoted from the ranks. Only Robertson was that. And Robertson was always the quartermaster, the organiser, the person behind the throne, and even as Chief of the Imperial General Staff was by definition not the one at the battlefield. But if you take him out of the equation, everyone else fits that image of people who were, to some extent, more or less well off. And many, of course, came from the Northern Irish gentry, so what is today Northern Ireland's gentry, but some of them from other unionist communities within Ireland. But the bulk of them were a kind of special subgroup, if you like, none of whom were very wealthy. That was one reason why they went into the army, was that it offered a career. But nonetheless, they were coming from a background of relative security, certainly socially, if not always economically. So that idea that the generals were not up to the job becomes quite dominant until you get Haig, the educated soldier. And John Terraine challenges that basic understanding and says, no, hang on a minute. Haig did try to use new technology. Yes, the tanks broke down in 1916. Yes, not all of them made it across the start line, etc. But, let's be fair, he was trying to use a new weapon that's better than someone who says they won't. And irony of ironies, thinking of World War Two, it's the British who developed the tank and the Germans who largely ignore it. So Terrain's book underpinned the point that there was no simple blimp-like general figure, but it doesn't tackle some of the key themes. So even if you take on board that he was educated, that he read a lot, that he was doing his best, nonetheless, as been argued by others, he was focused on the wearing out fight. He was focused on this idea that as long as the British took fewer casualties than the Germans, over time the Germans would lose. So it's a pretty unimaginative strategy. And when you look at the controversy around Third Ypres or Passchendaele, that's really clear. The biggest case against Haig, Gary Sheffield's recently argued about the Somme and to what extent Rawlinson rather than Haig was responsible for the failures to follow up on the good bits of the Somme. So you can make an argument around the Somme. There's evidence on both sides. But with Third Ypres, it is really difficult to see that. The conception of the plan, okay. The idea of having a go in the Ypres salient area makes some sense. The idea of combining it with a coastal offensive and opening up the Channel ports so that they couldn't be used by German submarines, all of that makes good sense. But at the end of the day, the decision to entrust the attack to Gove was a serious error, and one based on the fact that Haig wanted someone who wouldn't argue with him. There's since been some discussion as to whether, when subsequently Plumer was brought in, that in fact his methods didn't work as well initially after a certain point, Broadside Ridge being a kind of dividing point. But again, that begs the question, why did they send those last lot of attacks in? The last, Canadians were sacrificed appallingly to finally seize Passchendaele. Strategically, the position was so weak that they withdrew from it in the spring. So it wasn't worth that final stage, even if it was worth the earlier stages. And what seems to be happening now is that the only people who are publishing widely, the sort of people whose books you get in an airport, are people who have adopted the learning curve theory, for which there is plenty of evidence, and I've argued for that in my own work, but who do not want to accept that actually there were serious errors of generalship, even in the later stages of the war. So they want to have this idea that the generals had got it right and that gradually it was the politicians who were the problem. So, by 1917, in theory, British Army knows what it's doing, and it can achieve things. Certainly that's true in the latter part of 1918 and arguably in parts of 1917. But what fundamentally still begs the question is some absolutely disastrous assaults at Passchendaele. Arras, not exactly a triumph. March 1918, was that the politicians? Was that the army? Now, you can make a pretty strong case that in 1918, as March came, the British army was not supplied with enough men. It was too overstretched. You can see all of those points. And Gove, who I think should have been sacked for Passchendaele, was sacked for Fifth Army's defeat. which it probably wasn't his fault. So the irony was that he was sent home for something that he was out of his control. But nonetheless, why was he in charge of such a critical front? What was the point of him being there? Largely because Haig knew that he would take orders from Haig and follow them, whereas some other army commanders would, at least within the structure of the army, push back a little bit. But the real crux is Britain lost a large number of men at Passchendaele. The original plan involved a sea attack, a coastal attack. That attack was preempted by the Germans launching their offensive, the so-called Beach Party offensive. That took out 1st Division, who were preparing for the landing Operation Hush that might have taken the German positions in the flank. Now you can argue, technically at the time, did they know enough? Did they understand enough as to why they were going to be in that position, that they couldn't launch that attack? Why did they not then step back? Rawlinson was told to cancel the plan after the German attack. The cabinet were not informed that there had been a change. So therefore, when the assault for Passchendaele goes in, the cabinet are not aware that the full extent of the exploitation of the opportunities was no longer available. And you'd have to wonder whether the cabinet would have approved it, that is the Third Ypres battle, if they had known just how far off they were from being fully prepared. And that is something clearly the British generals couldn't make a decision about. The German Beach Party could argue that the preparations on the side with 1st Division were a bit too obvious, but nonetheless they can't stop the Germans launching Beach Party. But what they could have done was then to have said, that was the strategic element of our plan, so now we've got to rethink our plan. And yes, it's easy to blame Lloyd George afterwards, because he should have had more control. But the reality is the generals decided that 3rd Ypres would be fought, despite the fact that the presence of the Germans by the river meant that there was no chance of the British achieving a strategic breakthrough rather than a wearing out breakthrough. And what we've just seen, what we did see then, was exactly that happen. So the generals were blinkered about what way to go forward. They continued to be difficult, and the idea that everything was solved in 1918 because of overstretched Germans is partially correct. The launching of the March Offensive in 1918 and its failure effectively delivered the Western Front to the Allies for later in the war. But it just demonstrates that it wasn't actually the generalship that was helping Britain win the war. It was the way in which the other side were failing to deal with their difficulties, their problems, including, by late 1918, massive shortages of food at home in Germany and the problems created by such a long and dangerous war with so many casualties, leading to a political breakdown of the will to be completely united in pursuing the war any further. So, was Gove right? He was right to the extent that there was a degree of exaggeration. Was he right to say that there's a left-wing myth? Possibly there is a left-wing myth that doesn't agree or doesn't recognise that the people doing the analysis are basing it on what solidly happened. It's very easy to believe that you can't have hindsight because somehow generals can't be subjected to hindsight. But their drum, the sound that they beat to, reflects the way in which everyone else is then treated. So I think it's really important to recognise that even in 1918, the British officer class was being run as an officer class, and they were looking, by the end of 1918, at who was going to stay on, who was going to keep what post in what they believed would be a much smaller British army. I hope that's been of interest, and I hope that's given some thought, and that you enjoy that video as well as hopefully you've enjoyed the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on the programme, and thank you to Millie and Alfie for not barking during the talk. Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk from Dr. Peaple. Thank you again for watching, and it was lovely having you here.